Okay, now can you hear me? Let's see here. Let me wait for my stream to catch up. Let me wait for my stream. Can I hear myself? Maybe that's... Let me wait for my stream. Can I hear myself? Maybe that's... Okay. So we are good to go. Hello and welcome to my stream. I am going to be reading J.B. Priestley's The Good Companions, so feel free to curl up and enjoy the book. Chapter 1. Mr. Oakroyd Leaves Home. There, far below, is the knobbly backbone of England, the Pennine Range. At first, the whole dark length of it, from the Peak to Crossfell, is visible. Then the Derbyshire hills and the Cumberland fells disappear, for you are descending somewhere about the middle of the range, where the high moorland thrusts itself between the woolen mills of Yorkshire and the cotton mills of Lancashire. Great winds blow over miles and miles of ling and bog and black rock, and the curlews still go crying in that empty air as they did before the Romans came. There is a glitter of water here and there, from the moorland tarns that are now called reservoirs. In summer you could wander here all day, listening to the larks, and never meet a soul. In winter you could lose your way in an hour or two, and die of exposure perhaps, not a dozen miles from where the Bradford trams end, where the Burnley trams begin. Here are Bodkin Top and Highgreve and Blackmoor and Four Gates End, and though these are lonely places, almost unchanged since the Doomsday Book was compiled, you cannot understand industrial Yorkshire and Lancashire, the wool trade and the cotton trade and many other things besides, such as the popularity of Handel's Messiah or the Northern Union rugby game, without having seen such places. They hide many secrets. Where the moor thins out are patches of ground called intake, which means that they are a land wrested from the grasp of the moor. Over to the right is a long smudge of smoke, beneath which the towns of the West Riding lie buried, and fleeces, tops, noils, yarns, stuffs come and go, in and out of the mills, down to the railways and canals and lorries. All this, too, you may say, is a kind of intake. At first, the towns only seem a blacker edge to the high moorland, so many fantastic outcroppings of its rock, but now that you are closer, you see the host of tall chimneys, the rows and rows of little houses, built of blackening stone that are like tiny, sharp ridges on the hills. These windy moors, these clanging dark valleys, these factories and little stone houses, this business of intaking, have between them bred a race that has special characteristics. Down there are thousands and thousands of men and women who are stocky and hold themselves very stiffly, who have short upper lips and long chins, who use empathetic consonants and very broad vowels, and always sound aggressive, who are afraid of nothing but mysterious codes of etiquette and any display of feeling. If it were night, you would notice strange constellations low down in the sky, and little golden beetles climbing up to them. These would be street lamps and lighted tram cars on the hills, for here such things are little outposts in no man's land, and altogether more adventurous and romantic than ordinary street lamps and tram cars. It is not night, however, but a late September afternoon. Some of its sunshine lights up the nearest of the towns, most of it jammed into a narrow valley running up to the moors. It must be Bruddersford, for there, where so many roads meet, is the town hall, and if you know the district at all, you must immediately recognize the Bruddersford Town Hall, which has a clock that plays Tom Bowling and The Lass of Richmond Hill. It has been called a noble building in the Italian Renaissance style, and always looks as if it had no right to be there. Yes, it is Bruddersford. Over there is the enormous factory of Messrs. Holdsworth and Company, Limited, which has never been called a noble building in any style, but nevertheless looks as if it had a perfect right to be there. The roof of the Midland Railway Station glitters in the sun, and not very far away is another glitter from the glass roof of the Bruddersford Market Hall, where, securely under cover, you may have a ham tea or buy boots and pans and mint humbugs and dress lengths and comic songs. That squat bulk to the left of the town hall is the Lane End Congregational Chapel, a monster that can swallow any 2,000 people who happen to be in search of hearty singing and a bright service. That streak of slime must be the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, or the Aaron Calder Canal, one of the two. There is a little forest of mill chimneys. Most of them are only puffing meditatively, and it is Saturday, and nearly 4 hours since the work-people swarmed out through the big gates. Some of the chimneys show no signs of smoke. They have been quiet for a long time, have stayed there like monuments of an age that has vanished, and all because trade is still bad. Perhaps some of these chimneys have stopped smoking because fashionable women in Paris and London and New York have cried to one another, "My dear, you can't possibly wear that," and less fashionable women have repeated it after them, and quite unfashionable women have finally followed their example. And it has all ended in machines lying idle in Bruddersford. You feel that it will do something about it, that it is only biding its time, that it will hump its way through somehow. The place wear a grim and resolute look. Yet this afternoon is not thinking about the wool trade. Something very queer is happening in the narrow thoroughfare to the west of the town. It is called Manchester Road, because it actually leads you to that city, though in order to get there you will have to climb to the windy roof of England and spend an hour or two with the curlews. What is so queer about it is that the road itself cannot be seen at all. A grey-green tide flows sluggishly down its length. It is a tide of cloth caps. These caps have just left the ground of the Bruddersford United Association Football Club. 35,000 men and boys have just seen what most of them call United play Bolton Wanderers. Many of them should never have been there at all. It would not be difficult to prove by statistics in those mournful little budgets how a man may live, or rather avoid death, on 35 shillings a week, that seem to attract some minds, that these fellows could not afford the entrance fee. When some mills are only working half the week and others not at all, a shilling is a respectable sum of money. It would puzzle an economist to discover where all these shillings came from, but if he lived in Bruddersford, though he might still wonder where they came from, he would certainly understand why they were produced. To say that these men paid their shillings to watch 22 hirelings kick a ball is merely to say that a violin is wood and catgut, that Hamlet is so much paper and ink. For a shilling, the Bruddersford United AFC offered you conflict and art. It turned you into a critic, happy in your judgment of fine points, ready in a second to estimate the worth of a well-judged pass, a run down the touch line, a lightning shot, a clearance kick by back or goalkeeper. It turned you into a partisan, holding your breath when the ball came sailing into your own goal mouth, ecstatic when your forwards raced away towards the opposite goal, elated, downcast, bitter, triumphant by turns at the fortunes of your side, watching a ball shape Iliads and Odysseys for you. And what is more, it turned you into a member of a new community, all brothers together for an hour and a half, for not only had you escaped from the clanking machinery of this lesser life, from work, wages, rent, doles, sick pay, insurance cards, nagging wives, ailing children, bad bosses, idle workmen, but you had escaped with most of your mates and your neighbors, with half the town, and there you were, cheering together, thumping one another on the shoulders, swapping judgments like lords of the earth, having pushed your way through a turnstile into another and altogether more splendid kind of life, hurtling with conflict and yet passionate and beautiful in its art. Moreover, it offered you more than a shilling's worth of material for talk during the rest of the week. A man who had missed the last home match of to United had to enter social life on tiptoe in Bruddersford. Somewhere in the middle of this tide of cloth caps is one that is different from its neighbors. It is neither gray nor green, but a rather dirty brown. Then, unlike most of the others, it is not too large for its wearer, but, if anything, a shade too small, though it is true he has pushed it back from his forehead as if he were too hot, as indeed he is. This cap and the head it has almost ceased to decorate are both the property of a citizen of Bruddersford, an old and enthusiastic supporter of the United Football Club, whose name is Josiah Oakroyd. He owes his curious Christian name to his father, a lanky, weaving overlooker who divided his leisure in alternating periods of sin and repentance between the Craven Arms and the Lane End Primitive Methodist Chapel, where he chanced to hear the verse from 1 Chronicles of the sons of Uzziel, Micah the first, and Josiah the second, the very day before his second son was born. To all his intimates, however, Mr. Oakroyd is known as Jess. He is a working man between 45 and 50 years of age, a trifle under medium height, but stockily built, neither ugly nor handsome, with a blunt nose, a mustache that may have been once brisk and fair, but is now ragged and mousy, and blue eyes that regard the world pleasantly enough, but with just a trace of either wonder or resentment, or both. He lives almost in the shadow of two great factories, in one of those districts known locally as Backata Mill, to be precise, at 51 Ogden Street. He has lived there these last 20 years and is known to the whole street as a quiet man and a decent neighbor. He is on his way there now, returning from the match to his Saturday tea, which takes a high rank in the hierarchy of meals, being perhaps second only to Sunday dinner. He has walked this way home from the match hundreds of times, but this Saturday in late September is no ordinary day for him. Although he does not know it, for it is the very threshold of great events. Chance and change are preparing an ambush. Only a little way before him there dangles invitingly the end of a thread. He must be followed and watched. As he moved slowly down Manchester Road, the press of fellow spectators still thick about him, Mr. Oakroyd found himself brooding over the hollow vanities of his life. He felt unusually depressed. His physical condition may have had something to do with it, for he was hot, dusty, and tired. There had been a full morning's work before him at the mill. He had hurried through his dinner, walked to the ground, and had been on his feet ever since. Manchester Road, after a match, had never seemed so narrow and airless. A chap could hardly breathe in such a crowd of folk. And what a match it had been! For once he was sorry he had come. No score at all, not a single goal on either side. Even a goal against the United would have been something, would have wakened him up a bit. The first half had been nothing but exasperation, with the United all round the Wanderers' goal, but never able to score. Centres clean flung away, open goals missed, crazy football. The second half had not been even that, nothing but aimless kicking about on both sides. A kid's game. During the time that it took him to progress 300 yards down the crowded road, Mr. Oakroyd gave himself up to these bitter reflections. A little farther along, where there was more room, he was able to give them tongue, for he jostled an acquaintance, who turned around and recognized him. "Nah, Jess," said the acquaintance, taking an imitation calabash pipe out of his mouth, and then winking mysteriously. "Nah, Jim," returned Mr. Oakroyd. This "nah," which must once have been "now," is the recognized salutation in Bruddersford, and the fact that it sounds more like a word of caution than a word of greeting is by no means surprising. You have to be careful in Bruddersford. "Well," said Jim, falling into step, "what did you think on 'em?" "Think on 'em?" Mr. Oakroyd made a number of noises with his tongue to show what he thought of them. "Ah, thought the United made rings round 'em," Jim remarked. "And they ought to ha' done," said Mr. Oakroyd, with great bitterness. "And so they would ha' done if they'd nobbut tried a bit. I've seen 'em better nor this when they'd lost. They were better nor this when they lost to Newcastle t'other week. Better by far." "Aye, a seat better," said the other. "Did you ever see such a match? I'd as soon go and see school lads at it. A shilling fair thrown away, I call it." And for a moment he brooded over his lost shilling. Then, suddenly changing his tone and becoming very aggressive, he went on. "Yon new centre forward they've gotten, McDermott, or whatever he's called, he never of aught, never. He were like a great lass on the job. And what did they pay for him? Were it £2,000? Aye," Mr. Oakroyd made this monosyllable very expressive. £2,000. That's about 1,000 ivory gold he missed today. Watson were worth 20 on him. I liked that lad, and if they'd let him alone, he'd ha' done summut for him. And then they go and get this McDermott and pay £2,000 for him to kick the ball over the top. Jim lit his yellow monster of a pipe and puffed away with an air of great satisfaction. He had obviously found a topic that would carry him comfortably through the evening. In the tap-room of the Hare and Hounds, the next morning in the East Bruddersford Working Men's Club, and possibly Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday nights. Mr. Oakroyd walked on in silence, quickening his pace now that the crowd was not so thick, and there was room to move. At the corner of Manchester Road and Shuttle Street, both men halted, for here their paths diverged. "I'll tell that what it is, Jess," said his companion, pointing the stem of his pipe and becoming broader in his Yorkshire as he grew more philosophical. "If United had less brass to lake wi', they'd lake better football." His eyes searched the past for a moment, looking for a team that had less money and had played better football. "That can remember when t' club had niver set eyes on £2,000, when two jobs lot were not worth £2,000, pavilion and all, and what sort of football did they lake then? We know, don't we? They could get thee summut worth watching them. Nah, it's all nowt like Dale and baccy. They ask so much for money, fair with thrown away, all calls it. Well, we munna wear teas and get over it. Behave the sen, Jess." And he turns away, for the final word of caution was only one of Bruddersford's familiar goodbyes. "Aye," replied Mr. Oakroyd dispiritedly. "So long, Jim." He climbed to the upper deck of a tram that would carry him through the centre of the town to within a few hundred yards of Ogden Street. There he sat, his little briar pipe, unlit and indeed empty, stuck in the corner of his mouth, his cap still pushed back from his glistening forehead, staring out of a disenchantment. At times the train jerked him forward, but only to return him with a bang against the hard back of the seat. People who were larger than usual in all parcels and elbows pushed past or trod on his toes. It was no joke taking a tram on Saturday in Bruddersford. "I call this 2 penn'orth o' misery, missus," he said to a very large woman who wedged herself into the seat beside him. She turned a damp scarlet face, and he saw that it was Mrs. Buttershaw, whose husband kept the little shop in Woolgate. Everybody in that district knew Buttershaw's, for it was no ordinary shop. It catered to both body and soul, one half of it being given up to tripe and cow heels, and the other half to music, chiefly sixpenny songs and cheap gramophone records. Strangers frequently stopped in front of Buttershaw's to stare and laugh, but strangers are easily amused. All the people round about recognized that this was a sensible arrangement, for some wanted tripe, some wanted music, and not a few wanted both. "Oh, well, if it isn't Mr. Oakroyd." Mrs. Buttershaw knew him as both a patron of the tripe counter and an old neighbor. "I didn't see you. And how are you?" "Middlin', said Mr. Oakroyd with the air of one determined to give nothing away. "I've been meaning to ask you for a long time," she went on, "only I haven't seen your— How's your Lily doing, and where's it? Ameriky?" "Canada," said Mr. Oakroyd, announced promptly and rather proudly. "Canada! That's it. It's all the same, isn't it? Only some calls it one thing and some calls it another. Well, how's she getting on there? It doesn't seem more than a week or 2 since she was a bit of a lass coming in for a pantomime song. She liked a bit of music, didn't she? And now she's a married woman in Canada." "She's doing all right," Mr. Oakroyd vainly trying to appear unconcerned. "I'd a letter the other day," and he did not add that that letter, which began, "My dear father and mother, I write these few lines to let you know we are all right, as I hope you are," was reposing in his coat pocket, having been carried there, and brought out and reread at frequent intervals these last 3 days. "She's settled in, has she?" said Mrs. Buttershaw, who apparently thought of Canada as a sort of house. "Aye, she's settling nicely, is Lily. Been there nearly a year." "Eh, fancy that! A year! Well, I never did." Mrs. Buttershaw seemed to have these exclamations shaken out of her by the jerky movements of the tram. "Who was it she married?" "I ought to know, but I've forgotten. I shall forget me own name soon. I'm that bad at remembering." "Jack Clough, old Sammy's youngest lad," replied Mr. Oakroyd. "He were a fitter at Sharp's." "Eh, of course!" she exclaimed triumphantly. "I knew him well. You were often in buying a bit of a comic song and such like. He were a nice lad and a lively card. But then your Lily was a lively lass, full of fun." "Aye, lively enough. You knew when she was about." Mr. Oakroyd tried to speak offhandedly, but his voice warmed and his eyes were alight with affectionate reminiscence. He had always adored this only daughter of his. She had been the funniest baby, the cleverest child, and the prettiest girl in that part of Bruddersford, or for that matter, in any other part. There was something wonderful about everything she did and said, even her naughtiness, and she had always had a will of her own, had seemed to him only a special sort of fun and prettiness, as good as a play. "You must miss her. I know I do myself. Even Joe was asking me about her the other day. He didn't know that she'd gotten married and gone away. He knows not, doesn't Joe? He's always a year or 2 behind." But she said this in such a way as to hint that Mr. Buttershaw, with one eye on his tripe and the other on his music, was rather above this business of knowing things, an absent-minded genius. "There wasn't a nicer little lass come into the shop, And yer can put that feather in your cap." Mr. Oakroyd was so shaken out of his reserve by this praise that he proclaimed very earnestly, I miss her all right. I didn't know I could miss anybody so much. Place fair seems empty like sometimes." For a minute or two nothing more was said. No doubt both of them felt that this last speech had reached the limits to which confession might be pushed, beyond were extravagance and indecency, and a good Bredersfordian left such wild regions to actors and Londoners and such like. Mr. Oakroyd looked out of the window. The day was just crossing the little magical bridge between afternoon and evening. The early autumn sunlight was bent on working a miracle. A moment of transformation had arrived. It hushed and gilded the moors above them, and then, just when Mr. Oakroyd's tram reached the center of the town, passing on one side of the Central Free Library and on the other the Universal Sixpenny Bazaar, it touched Bredersford. All the spaces of the town were filled with smoky gold. Holmes and Hadley's Emporium, the Midland Railway Station, the Wool Exchange, Barclay's Bank, the Imperial Music Hall, all shone like palaces. Smithson Square was like some quivering western sea, and the Right Honourable Ebenezer Smithson himself, his marble scroll, now a map of the Indies, was conjured into an Elizabethan admiral. The facades of Market Street towered strangely and spread a wealth of carven stone before the sun. Town Hall Square was a vast place of golden light, and its famous clock, as it moved to celebrate the enchanted moments, gave a great whir and then shook down into the streets its more rapturous chimes, the lass of Richmond Hill. To all this sudden magic Mr. Oakroyd, sucking at his empty pipe and staring through the window, might have seemed entirely unresponsive. He was not, however. One hand went fumbling up his shabby coat. It would have gone further, would have plunged into the inner pocket if its owner had not been sharing a seat with Mrs. Buttershaw, who was of a breadth beyond the dreams of the tramways department. But if the hand could not bring out a letter, it could feel that it was there, and having done so, it dropped, satisfied. "And now," said Mrs. Buttershaw, looking with disapproval at the warehouse of Messrs. Hoggleby, Sons and Company Limited. In those shadow they were. "Is that lad of yours getting on?" Mr. Oakroyd's face immediately changed, putting on a grim and satirical expression. "I can't say. He tells me not. I think he'll be all right as long as there's still a good supply of brilliantine and fancy socks, and plenty of young women, with naught but to do but look for chaps." Leonard might be the darling of his mother's heart, as indeed he was, but it was clear that his father had no great opinion of him. Neither, it appeared, had Mrs. Buttershaw. "I seen him on Wednesday," she said severely, "standing outside a picture place. I think it were to Plazer. And you'd have thought he owned it. 'That's Mr. Oakroyd's lad,' I says to Joe, but Joe didn't know him. Joe knows nobody, and been in a shop for 30 year. Nay, I never seen such a man. You wouldn't know me next, I tell him. But when I showed him your lad, Joe says, 'Well, if that's Jess Oakroyd's lad, he's not like his father. He looks a bit like a swank pot.' 'Nay, Joe,' I says, 'you know not about the lad.' But I knew what he meant. He doesn't like to see these lads all toffed up, doesn't Joe? Where's your Leonard working now? Is he still in Barrowcutting?" "Aye, he's still at Bob Phil's in Volgate," said Mr. Oakroyd, who did not seem to resent these remarks. "Well," said Mrs. Buttershaw, gathering together her assortment of packages and her immense form, "they'll never get fat on what's old Bob's Phil gives 'em. I never reckoned naught o' barbers, and Bob's Phil's one of the meanest. You'd go blind looking for a threepenny." And she heaved herself out of the seat, and as the tram slowed up, went waddling down the aisle. Mr. Oakroyd, beginning to expand again into what he felt to be his natural size, fell to thinking of his daughter and her letter. As soon as Lily had gone, 51 Ogden Street had suddenly shrunk and darkened, and there was no family life in it, no real home, only the three of them, there, eating and sleeping and sometimes squabbling, with Leonard and his doting mother on one side and him on the other. "Don't you have it, Dad? Don't you put up with it?" "You look after yourself," Lily had whispered, just before she went, breaking up an old and happy alliance. Since then he had had a certain mournful pleasure in not putting up with it, in trying to look after himself, but it was a poor sort of business now. He took the letter out of his pocket, but did not read it again. He had secretly hoped it would contain an invitation to him to go out there. He was ready to go at a word. A handy man like him could easily get work there. 6 months full-time at the mill would easily raise the passage money. But no invitation had come, not a word about it. He hoped she had thought of it, had suggested it, and that it was only because Jack Clough, who was a decent young chap, but, like the rest, bent on looking after number one, had put his foot down, that she had never said anything. He had mentioned it once or twice when he had written, just making a sort of little joke of it. What would your old father look like in Canada? He did not feel like doing more than that. They had their own way to make, and a baby was coming. He looked down at the letter, and then slowly tore it up, and slipped the fragments under the seat. The tram had ground its way to the Black Swan Inn, known locally as the Mucky Duck, and this was his stop. He walked rather slowly and heavily the few hundred yards that brought him to Ogden Street. Nobody could consider Ogden Street very attractive. It was very long and very drab, and contained 2 rows of singularly ugly black little houses. Yet Ogden Street had its boasts, and its residents could claim to have both feet on the social ladder. You could in fact have a come-down from Ogden Street, and there were some people who even saw it as a symbol of a prosperity long vanished. To begin with, it was a respectable street, not one of those in which you heard sudden screams in the night or the sound of police whistles. Then, too, it was entirely composed of proper houses, all with doors opening onto the street, and in this respect it was unlike its neighbors at the back, Velvet Street and Merino Street, which had nothing but passage or back-to-back houses, the product of an ingenious architectural scheme that crammed 4 dwelling places into the space of 2, and enabled some past citizens to drive a carriage and pair and take their wives and daughters to the Paris exhibition in 1867. When you lived in Ogden Street, you did not disdain to talk to the occupants of passage houses, but nevertheless, if you were a woman who knew how to enjoy yourself, you could afford to be sympathetic towards a humble passage-houser, or put a presumptuous one in her place. Many of these things had been known to Mr. Oakroyd, an old resident, for many years, but he did not entertain himself now with any recollection of them. The door which led directly into the single living room stood ajar. There was no one in the room, but voices were coming from upstairs. Somebody shouted, "Hello?" as he flung his cap down on the end of the shiny black sofa. He grunted a reply, went through to the scullery, where he hastily washed, returning with eyes still smarting from the yellow soap to look very dubiously at the table. What he saw made him shake his head. It was indeed the miserable ruin of a Saturday tea. 3 dirty cups, pushed to one end of the table, announced there had been earlier arrivals, and everything had the air of having been closely examined and then rejected. There were 2 pieces of bread and butter on one plate, half a buttered currant tea cake, and squashed lemon cheese tart on another, and on a third, for the tasty bit, the glory of the meal, were the mere remains, the washy flotsam and jetsam, of a tin of salmon. Mr. Oakroyd poked about with a fork in this pink mush, shook his head again, and made little clucking noises. Then he lifted the teapot from the fender, where it had been stewing its contents for some time, sat him down, and summoned what was left of a rapidly vanishing appetite. "You're back, are you?" This was Mrs. Oakroyd, who had come downstairs. She was a thin woman, with gleaming eyes, prominent cheekbones, a pinched nose reddened at the tip, and a long prow of chin. She had two passions, one for her son, Leonard, and the other for virtuous discomfort. "I'm house-proud," she reported to herself, and if she could fill the living room with steaming clothes a few minutes before her husband arrived home from work, she was happy. She had long regarded him neither a friend nor as a partner, but as a nuisance, somebody who was always coming in to upset the house, always demanding food and drink. The nuisance gave her one quick glance and saw at once that she was pleased about something, though ready at any moment to be quarrelsome about it. "Leonard's in this," he told himself, gave a nod, then gloomily poured some of the salmon onto his plate. "We had our teas," remarked Mrs. Oakroyd, coming forward into the room. "Aye, so I see," returned her husband dryly. "I wish I'd been there. There seems to have been a bit of a party like. Leonard's here, come home this afternoon and brought Albert Tugridge with him, so we all had our teas together." "Oh, Leonard's here, is he?" Mr. Oakroyd stared rather aggressively at his wife. "And what's Leonard doing here at this time of day? I suppose nobody in Woolgate district wants a shave now, a Saturday?" As this was the only day on which many Woolgate residents ever did want a shave, this remark was the grimmest irony. There was an added gleam in his wife's eyes. "Leonard's done with Woolgate. Left this morning. And not afore he told old Bob's Phil a thing or two either. Trust him," she added proudly. Mr. Oakroyd laid down his knife and fork. "Got into sack, has he? Or marched out? And what's he going to do now? I call that daft. Loud's got too big for his boots." The gleam was really triumphant now. She raised her voice. "I'll tell you what he's doing. He's going to work at Gregson's on Monday. There's a chap finishing there, and our Leonard takes his place. Gets £2 in what he makes, and you know what Gregson's is? Now then, what have you got to say about that?" He had nothing to say to it. He didn't know what Gregson's was, though he had never been a patron of such a lordly establishment. Gregson's city toilet rooms were in the centre of town, not 200 yards from Town Hall Square, and heads worth a mint of money had continually been trimmed there. It was impossible to say a word against Gregson's. Excuse me. £2 and tips galore," cried Mrs. Oakroyd. "It'll be £4.10, sometimes £5, he tells me, in a good week, with regular customers coming in, woolmen and travellers and such like. Well, I tells him, if it is, it's better money than your poor father ever brought home, and you only fower 4.20. Nay, I were that surprised. When I see him walking in with Albert Tugridge, middle of the afternoon, you could have knocked me down with a feather." "Aye," her husband put in, "and when I see the way they'd both walked into that salmon, you could have knocked me down with the same feather." Go on, that's right, go on," she cried with the shrillest irony. "The next time the lad gets a better job, I'll turn him and his friend out with a bit of tea. I'll tell him he can't have any, tell him it's all for his father. You've got as much there as we had. What you want's a cafe. What we sit down to isn't good enough for a man as can afford a shilling every week for a football match. He ought to have 'am and eggs every night. He ought steaks and chips every night. He ought, when he's so well off—" All right, growled Mr. Oakroyd, and tried to look like a man who had had enough of that nonsense. His wife gave a sniff, collected some dirty cups and plates, gave another sniff, then marched the things into the scullery, where she contrived to make an extraordinary clatter. Mr. Oakroyd let his features relapse into their ordinary appearance, loudly yet mournfully sucked at a hollow tooth, then took an immense bite of currant tea-cake and washed it down with a gulp of tea. "I'll bet the young women of Bruddersford will find it hard to keep their heads screwed on tonight," he observed when his wife returned. He nodded towards the stairs. "Is that Albert Tugridge up there now with Leonard?" "Yes. Leonard's getting ready to go out. They're off to a social and dance at Shuttle Street Rooms." Mr. Oakroyd smiled grimly. "I thought as much. There'll be some hearts broken in Shuttle Street tonight. It's fair cruel to let them two loose on the same night, and a Saturday and all. It don't give lasses a chance. Them as doesn't prostrate themselves afore Leonard'll fall before the all-conquering Albert. It's an absolute walkover for the male sex." His wife bristled. "A body'd think you'd never been young, Jess Oakroyd, the way you go on about them lads. Nay, I've been young. None so old yet, I'm thinking. But I were never so damned soft as yon two. Lady killers, I call 'em. Shuttle Street heartbreakers. Tut." It was not a bad description of Leonard and his friend Albert. With them and their like was perishing miserably and obscurely an old tradition. Though they did not know it, they were in truth the last of a long line, the last of the macaronis, the dandies, the swells, the mashers, the nuts. Their old home, the West End, knows these figures no longer. Their canes and yellow gloves, their pearl-buttoned fawn overcoats, their brillantine and scent and bouquets, their music-hall promenades and their hansoms, their ladies, with elaborate golden coiffures, full busts and naughty frills, all have gone, all went floating to limbo long ago on their last tide of champagne, and some foolish and almost forgotten song in perky 6/8 time of boys and girls upon the spree in Piccadilly or Leicester Square is their requiem. But just as a tide of fashion raging fiercely in Mayfair for a season will go rolling on, depositing black vases or orange cushions in drawing-rooms, more and more remote year after year, so too the tradition of dandyism and lady-killing, after it had forsaken its old home, lingered on in towns like Bruddersford, and among such men as Leonard and Albert. They lived for dress and girls, above all, not having the opportunities of a Brummel for girls. They ogled and pursued and embraced girls at the Bruddersford dances and socials, in all of the local parks and woods, picture theatres and music halls. They followed them on the Bridlington sands, all along the Morecambe piers, into the Blackpool ballrooms, and even went as far as Douglas IOM to treat them to 18-penny glasses of champagne and other notorious aphrodisiacs. They knew, and frequently discussed among themselves, the precise difference between the factory girls of Bruddersford and the factory girls of Bradford or Huddersfield. Between the tailoresses of Leeds and the shop girls of Manchester, they were masters of the art of picking up, and young as they were, already veteran strategists in the war against feminine chastity or prudence, and were untiring in the chase, tracking these bright creatures for weeks through the dark jungle of West Riding streets, but apt to be either bored or frightened by the kill. In the end, most of them, as they said, got caught, and were to be seen walking out of their old lives, those epics of gallantry, pushing a perambulator. The two young men now descended the stairs. Leonard walked in first, still patting his purple silk tie. He is a thin youth, with a very elaborate and greasy arrangement of curls and waves in his hair, a hardening eye and a loosening mouth, and an unfortunate habit of becoming spotty about the forehead. His friend Albert, clerk to Swollen's, the noisiest and shadiest auctioneer in the town, is larger and louder, and likes to brighten all social occasions by imitating the public manner of his master. Having no family in Bruddersford, he lives in lodgings a few streets away, where he says he is very comfortable. Already it has been suggested several times, both by Leonard and his mother, that Albert might lodge with them, but Mr. Oakroyd, who does not want a lodger, and especially does not want to see any more of Albert, rages at the mere hint of such a proceeding. "My words, Leonard," cried Mrs. Oakroyd, wiping her hands at the scullery door, "you're a swell tonight, all right." To see him standing there in his new chocolate-colored suit, with his purple socks and tie and handkerchief, was as good as an evening out to her, better than the pictures. "Not so dusty, Mar," said Leonard, tapping a cigarette against the back of his hand. "Well, well, well," shouted Albert, winking at Mr. Oakroyd, who was pushing his chair back. "'Ere we are, all merry and bright, the old firm. And how many runs did the old United make today?" And he winked at everybody. Mr. Oakroyd, who wanted to kick him, bent over his pipe and his packet of old salt tobacco and grunted. "Drew, 0-0. Not much for a bob there and then. What do you say, Len?" Albert went to the hearth and straddled there. "The poor old United will have to do better before they see my money." "Rorther, said Leonard, who was fond of entertaining company at times with an imitation of a musical comedy duke. This was one of the times. "Quite, roared Albert, who knew his cue. Mr. Oakroyd, with the air of a man who had heard all this too many times already, very deliberately lit his pipe, then relieved his feelings by blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Well, they'll try and get on without your money, Albert," he remarked, relishing his irony. "They'll have to manage somehow, though it'll be a bad lookout for 'em. I can see that. Have you told 'em yet, or are you letting 'em find it out for theirselves?" At this moment Mrs. Oakroyd and Leonard disappeared into the scullery, where they could be heard whispering. Albert cocked an ear in that direction and then opened fire himself. "You've heard the news? Len's new job. Good biz, good biz. Got a rise myself last week. Good biz. We're making money. What do you say?" It was plain that Mr. Oakroyd had very little to say, that it was not a subject that inspired him. He took out his pipe, looked at it, and then looked at Albert, and asked very quietly if Mr. Swollens had sold any more mahogany wardrobes lately. This was a malicious question, because Mr. Swollens had once got into trouble, and a half-column report into the Bruddersford Evening Express, because he sold a certain mahogany wardrobe. But Albert was not abashed. Now then, we all know about that. Tricks in all trades. Did you know I was looking for fresh digs? I heard somewhat about that. Well then, what do you say to having this little drop of sunshine in the old 'ome? What do you think of that? Good company and a good pair? Right on the nail every Friday night." Mr. Oakroyd shook his head. "It won't wash, lad." "Right on the nail every Friday," Albert repeated with gusto, "and all the family in favour." "It won't wash. We don't want no lodgers here. There's plenty as takes 'em without us. We don't want 'em." "Oh, we don't we?" This was from Mrs. Oakroyd, standing belligerent in the scullery doorway. Her husband gave a steady look, then raised his voice. "No, we don't." "Well, some of us thinks we do." "Then you mun think again, and think different," said Mr. Oakroyd with an air of finality, and before any of them could reply, he had taken his cap from the end of the sofa, clapped it on his head, and walked out. He told himself that he wanted a little stroll, another ounce of old salt, an early edition of the Evening Express Sports. But he knew he was afraid of what was coming. Having fired manfully his one big gun, he felt compelled to retreat. All the way down Ogden Street he kept repeating to himself, "Better money than your poor father ever brought home," and didn't like the look of things at all. The weekend had begun badly for Mr. Oakroyd, and it did not improve. The depression of Saturday afternoon could not be shaken off. He could think of nothing to look forward to. He was troubled by a vague foreboding. It was just as if a demonic black dog went trotting everywhere at his heels. Normally he was happy enough when he was smoking a pipe or two of old salt over the Evening Express Sports, learning how Kelly pushed the ball out of the Homester's left wing and MacDonald shot hard from a fine centre, but the visiting custodian made a great clearance. But this Saturday night he could not settle down to the welcome pink sheets. It followed him, this black dog, when he tried another stroll later into the centre of the town, and it even found its way with him into the singing room of the Boy and Barrel, where he had a half-pint of bitter and listened to a purple-faced tenor, the victim of two passions, one for Doreen, his darling and his queen, and the other for home, just a tumble-down cottage. Nor had it departed when he called on his return home at Thwaites' fish and chip shop, It called itself the West End Supper Bar, but nobody took any notice of that, and ate 3 Penrith chips and a tail while exchanging some remarks on United with Sam Thwaites, that excellent critic of the game. Sunday morning was no better. To begin with, there was a bit of an argument about Albert Tugridge at breakfast. Then the Imperial News, with which, like 2 million other Britons, he spent Sunday morning, for once gave him no pleasure. Listlessly he turned from secrets of European courts to dope dens of Mayfair, from what the husband saw to scandals of the boxing ring, and the most startling revelations, the most terrible disclosures, failed to brighten his eye. At 11:30 he went to the Woolgate Working Men's Club, and sat there over a half-pint, only to learn to his disgust that young Mondry had been made secretary of the local branch of his trade union, the textile, wagon, and warehouse workers. Mr. Oakright had not been on good terms with his union for some time, and this appointment of Mondry, a hatchet-faced young fanatic who had an unqualified admiration of Russian methods, meant that very soon he would be on even worse terms. He disliked the chap, and only a fortnight ago in this very club they had had a long and loud argument, during which Mr. Oakright had horrified his opponent by calling proletariat, a term that Mondry used in every other sentence, excuse me, and regarded as sacred, a bloody daft word. After that cheerless half-pint he went home to a dinner that was a sulky, silent affair and none too good. This is what he had expected. He knew he had now seen the last of his wife's best efforts in cookery for some time. In the afternoon he dozed uneasily for an hour or so, suddenly decided to walk to the park, found he had gone far enough when only halfway there, and came back, dusty and gloomy, to a solitary tea. Leonard had gone off for the day, and Mrs. Oakroyd was taking tea with some fellow worshipper at the Woolgate Congregational Chapel. Mr. Oakroyd ate and drank a good deal in an absent-minded fashion, then smoked 2 pipes of old salt, while he gave himself to a mournful survey of this life. It was nearly 7 o'clock when he finally decided how to spend the evening. He would go and see his friend Sam Oglethorpe out at Wobbly. Having arrived at this decision, he immediately felt more cheerful, for to go as far as Wobbly, which is 4 miles out of Bruddersford, and almost on the edge of the moors, was something to do, indeed quite a little adventure, and he knew that Sam would be in and ready to welcome him. What he did not know was that this was a most momentous decision, that here was not a little adventure, but the beginning of all manner of great adventures. That the thread now dangling in the empty space of his life was almost within reach. The destiny was hard at work as he had his wash at the scullery sink, walked, took a tram, walked again out to Wobbly. Yes, Sam was in, and glad to see him, and together they went down to the run and looked at hens. The two had worked side by side for years in the wagon department of Higden & Co., but 2 or 3 years ago they had parted company, for Sam had come into money, having been left £400 by an uncle who had kept an off-licensed shop, and had boldly walked out of Higden's, never to return. He was now on his own at Wobbly, the proud proprietor of a large hen-run, a little cottage, and a sign that said, "Joinery and Jobbing Work," promptly attended to. That was why Mr. Oakroyd regarded his friend with admiration and envy, for he too would like to walk out of Higden's for the last time, to have done with wages and foremen and the tyrannical buzzer. Deep in his heart was a sign about joinery and jobbing work. The hoisting of that sign, proclaiming Jess Oakroyd, the independent craftsman, to the world, was one of his constant dreams. And he was a better craftsman than Sam, too. Give him a saw, a hammer, a few nails, and he could do anything. But Sam, assisted by the off-licensed uncle, had managed to scramble out, while he was still in up to the neck, and lucky perhaps to be keeping on at Higden's at all. Now the last hen dismissed, they were cosily talking over pipes and a jug of beer. They were not in Mr. Oglethorpe's cottage, which was simply a place to eat and sleep in, and not meant, as anybody in Wobbly would tell you, for social life. No, they were sitting snugly in Mr. Oglethorpe's combined hen-house and workshop, with a jug of beer on a bench between them. If you want to know what independent men in Bruddersford and district think about life, you must listen to the talk that comes floating out of hen-houses at night. A man can afford to let himself go in a hen-house. Sam had been letting himself go, enlarging upon his plans and prospects, his hens, his joinery, his jobbing, to all of which Mr. Oakroyd had been listening with a deep and admiring attention. It was now time he had a look in, and Mr. Oglethorpe, like the good fellow he was, knew it, and gave him his cue. "Aye," said Mr. Oglethorpe, who had the slow, meditative manner that properly belongs to jobbing work. "That's what happens in this sort of business at Wobbly. Aye, and in Bruddersford too. Did you give it any attention, Jess, when you was down south? It'll be a bit different there, I'm thinking." Mr. Oakroyd's face lit up at once. This "down south" was the cue. This was where he came in and more than held his own, for if in this company Mr. Oglethorpe was the independent man, the owner of hens and a sign, the craftsman at large who could smoke his pipe when he liked, Mr. Oakroyd was the travelled man who had knocked up and down a bit, who could talk of what were, to Mr. Oglethorpe, who had never been anywhere, foreign parts. It was only in the company of his friend Sam that Mr. Oakroyd felt that he really had seen the world. He had not often been away from Bruddersford, though he had had a few little holidays at Morecambe, Blackpool, and Scarborough, had been on football trips to Manchester, Newcastle, Sheffield, and had once gone on a wonderful midnight excursion to London, and had actually seen St. Paul's and London Bridge before he fell asleep in an eating-house. But it happened that for a whole 6 months he had worked in Leicester, where his firm had a branch, and ever after he had referred to this exciting period as the time when he was down south. It was another of his dreams, companion to that of the hoisted sign, this happy business of travelling, of knocking about, of seeing this place and that, of telling how you once went there and then moved on somewhere else. And although he knew that he had seen nothing much yet, and probably never would now, yet he was able, nourished as he was by his secret dream, to capture the manner of the true wanderer. During his 6 months in Leicester, he had lodged in a street that could hardly be distinguished from his own Ogden Street, had worked at another Higden's mill that was just like the one in Bruddersford, except that it was smaller and cleaner. Yet when he had said "down south," he seemed to conjure up a vast journey towards the tropics, and at the end of it, a life entirely alien, fantastic. "Aye, it's different there, Sam," said Mr. Oakroyd, puzzling his brains to discover some proof of this difference. "It's altogether different there, it is." "Hold on a bit afore you tell me," the other cried, reaching for the jug. "There's another sup in this for both of us, I'm thinking. Ha, then." And he put a match to his pipe and looked across at his friend, his honest red face aglow. "Well, then, you see," began Mr. Oakroyd, but thought better of it and drank some beer instead. Then he reflected a moment. "Well, what I'd say is this. You're asking me how this sort of trade, joinery and jobbin', would go down south, aren't you?" "That's right, Jess," said Mr. Oglethorpe, looking very profound as he said this. "Well, what I'd say is this, that there mayn't be so much of it down there, but what there is 'd be a better class of thing. Do you follow me, Sam?" Sam did follow him, and looked more profound than ever as he slowly puffed at his short clay pipe. Nothing was said for a minute or two. Then Mr. Oglethorpe proceeded to light a very old and evil-smelling paraffin lamp that hung from the roof, and when he had done this, he broke the silence. "It'll be all different, I'm thinking, Jess. I could never settle to it, but I'll bet they liked it. I like a bit of a change, Sam. I'll bet they'd like to be off down there again next week," said Mr. Oglethorpe, with an air of great artfulness, as if he had caught his friend at last. "I might, and I might not," replied Mr. Oakroyd, who was not for giving himself away at once, not even in Sam's hen-house. But then the hour and his mood worked together to fling down his reserve. He leaned forward and looked at once eager and wistful. "I'll tell you what it is, Sam. I'd give out to see a bit more afore I'm too old." "You've seen summit already, Jess." Mr. Oglethorpe spoke proudly, as if his friendship gave him a share in these vast migrations. "Not much when you look at it." "Why, look at me," cried Mr. Oglethorpe. "I've never been farther in Weatherby to traces there. Nay, I'm lying, I have. I once went for a day to Southport to see the sea, and I never saw it, not a drop. It were a taking that." "I'd like to knock up and down a bit," Mr. Oakroyd went on, "and see what there is to see afore I'm too old and daft. I've gotten fair sick of Bruddersford lately, Sam, I have that. I'd like to get on to move." "Where do you want to go, Jess? Down south again? What is it you want to see?" "Nay, I don't know," said Mr. Oakroyd gloomily. "I'd like to see somewhat fresh. I'd like to have a look at, I don't know, Bristol." "Ar," said Mr. Oglethorpe knowingly. "Bristol." "Or I'd like to see, some of them places. Bedfordshire," he added at a venture. The other shook his head at this. "I never heard tell much of that place," he said gravely. "Is there aught special in Bedfordshire, Jess?" "Nay, I don't know," replied Mr. Oakroyd, a trifle impatiently, "but it's summit to see. I'd like to go and have a look, so I'd know if there was aught there or not. And I'll tell you another thing, Sam. I'd like to go to Canada." You never would, Jess." Mr. Oglethorpe slapped his thigh in appreciation of this audacity. "And if you got there, you'd want to be back in no time. Now to sup. They tell me, in snaw months and months on end. Plenty of money, I dare say, but not to spend it on." "Nay, Jess, I'll never believe you'd go as far as that." "I've a lass of mine there, Sam." "Ah, so you have. I'd forgotten. But I'll tell yer what it is. You ought to have been a wool buyer, Jess, and then you could have gone off all o'er the place and been paid for it. It has suited thee down to the ground." "I dare say," said Mr. Oakroyd grimly. "And I ought to have a motor car and £20 a week, and naught to do, and plenty of time to do it in." At this moment a voice cried, "Hello!" and a face appeared in the doorway. "Who's that?" "Oh, it's you, is it, Ted? Come in, lad, come in. You know my nephew Ted, Jess." And when Ted had sat himself down on an old coupe, Mr. Oglethorpe went on. "Now here's a lad as can tell you a thing or two about knocking up and down. He's never at home 5 minutes. Off with lorry and over to country, aren't you, Ted?" Ted, who was part owner of a lorry that called itself the Wobbly Transport Company, admitted that he knocked about a bit and knew a thing or two. "This lorrying ought to have been your line of business, Jess," Mr. Oglethorpe continued, winking at his nephew for no particular reason. "Where'd you go to next, lad?" "Off tomorrow," replied Ted, a laconic youth who preferred to talk like a ventriloquist with a cigarette in his mouth. "Load at Bruddersford, Merryweather's, Tap Street. Going to Nuneaton." "Shan't get off till tomorrow late." "What time, Ted?" asked his uncle, rather in the manner of counsel in court, as if he had already knew the answer himself. 10 or 11, perhaps 12. Merryweather's got a rush on. That's how we got the job. Travel all night, deliver in the morning. Hell of a game." And Ted, having finished his speech, took out a cigarette to whistle. "There you are, Jess. Hell of a game," Mr. Oglethorpe repeated triumphantly. "It'd do me," muttered Mr. Oakroyd. "It'd suit him," said Mr. Oglethorpe, turning to his nephew. "You'll have to give him a job on t' lorry, Ted." "Nothing done," replied Ted. "Wouldn't thank us if we did. We can have a trip when he likes, of course. See for himself then. Nothing in it. Been all over. Manchester. Liverpool, Newcastle, Leicester, Coventry, even taken it to London twice. Dozens of smaller places all over, nothing in it. Get sick of it. Same old carry-on every time. Places all alike when you come to know 'em. Nay, I'll be damned if they are, Mr. Oakroyd protested. You may have seen a sight more nor I have, but you must have given it a funny sort of look to think that. Places is as different as chalk and cheese. I soon picked that out when I were down south. Aye, that's right, Mr. Oglethorpe observed. I've heard Jess here tell many a time how different it is. I've seen not much, but you can niver tell me places is all alike. Why, there's Wobbly here is as different as out from all the other places round Bruddersford. Amazin', isn't it? Fair amazin'. Then Bruddersford near more like Leeds or Halifax than I'm like Billy Baxter. Who's Billy Baxter? This was from Ted, who ought to have known better. What? Never old Billy Baxter? Cried Mr. Oglethorpe in great glee. Well, well, well. Billy Baxter were the fellow that could never stand up without getting on his feet. Mr. Oglethorpe began to punch himself and shake and splutter and cough, until at last he was purple and helpless. "Tha hasn't selled that to anybody for years, Sam," said Mr. Oakroyd approvingly. "Ted's learned summat tonight, anyway." Ted, still with a cigarette in his mouth, was shaking his head and at the same time making a loud tut-tutting noise. He was not abashed as a man of the world. He could afford to ignore such primitive jests, but he knew that his prestige was gone for the remainder of the evening, and so, after giving his uncle a resounding slap or two on the back, he took his leave. Mr. Oakroyd stayed long enough to smoke another pipe, and was then steered through the darkness, for it was late now, by his host, who accompanied him as far as the tram terminus. The tram that was waiting there, however, only took him to the outskirts of Bruddersford, where it went groaning into its shed. Mr. Oakroyd would have to walk the rest of the way. As a rule, he liked to go to bed early on Sunday night, but now he was in no mood to consider Monday morning, more especially as he had just left the company of an independent craftsman and a man of travel. The night was fine, and he was not tired. Off he went with his old brown cap at the back of his head, whistling softly and watching a shadow that grew and then dwindled between one street lamp and the next. He was walking back into something that was beginning to look like slavery, but the large, quiet night was his, and a man might fancy himself anything, proprietor of a joinery and jobbing sign, owner of a lorry commanded to go to Bristol or Bedfordshire, even a chap going out to Canada to see his daughter, as he walked in peace through such a night. He was now in the Merton Park district, Bruddersford's best suburb, where the wool merchants and the manufacturers and the bank managers had their detached villas. These pleasant avenues were full of leafy shadows, for there were trees in the gardens, and trees alternating with the street lamps on the pavement itself. Now and then he heard the distant sound of a piano. 2 or 3 cars rolled past. Sometimes from the deeper shadows there came a whispering and sound of kissing, for lovers in Bruddersford favored the Merton Park district. There were very few of them about now, however, it was too late. Learoyd Avenue, longest and leafiest of these opulent roads, was very quiet. Yet it was in Learoyd Avenue, nearly at the end, just before it turns into Park Drive, that Mr. Oakroyd's adventures really began. He had just stepped from the lamp-lit pavement into the shadow of a tree, when he tripped over something and went sprawling. "What the blood—" he began, startled and shaking. "Shush, shush," said a voice close to his ear. "Naughty, naughty." Mr. Oakroyd scrambled to his feet and peered through the gloom at the figure beside him. "Here, mister, get up." "Excuse me." The other giggled quietly. "Can't get up," he said. "Can't possibly get up." "Well, you can't stay there all night, mister," said Mr. Oakroyd, who now understood the situation. "Can you now?" "Excuse me." I don't know," said the other meditatively. "Perhaps I can, perhaps I can't. Who knows?" Then in a tone of great melancholy he added, "Nobody knows, and nobody cares." Nobody. He seemed to be overcome by the pathos of this reflection. "Well, you've got a load on, and no mistake," said Mr. Oakroyd. Then he reached out a hand. Come on, this will never do. Hoist yourself up. That's right. Give me a hand, the hand of friendship. Up we go." And aided by Mr. Oakroyd, he struggled to his feet, clapped Mr. Oakroyd on the shoulder, nearly lost his balance again, and finally clung to his companion's arm, and began staggering down the road. The lamplight revealed to him as a large, red-faced man, very smart in a light gray felt hat, check suit, and spats. "You're a good fella," he cried, "a very good fella. And I'm a good fella, too. Both good fellas. What's your name? Mine's George. I've had a most extra astonishing time. Most astonishing. Been away nearly a week. Racist. Yes, I'm a ration man. Been to Doncaster all over. And lucky every time, every time. Do you know? And here George separated himself from his companion and stood swaying. "Well, I made this week." He waved a finger at Mr. Oakroyd, then repeated quite sternly, "Do you know?" "Nay, I don't know," replied Mr. Oakroyd good-humouredly. "But I'll bet it were more'n I did." "Well, I'll tell you," said George, gravely swaying. "I'll tell you. No, I won't, 'cause I've forgotten. But hundredish and hundredish. Lucky, very, very lucky. And now here I am, my friend, home again." And he steadied himself by grasping Mr. Oakroyd's arm again. "But where do you live, mister?" Round the corner. Had most astonishing adventures these last days. Came back in car with Polsh, good old Polsh. But gone, all gone. We had a little dispute. Fact is," and he lowered with his voice and almost rested his head on his companion's shoulder. "Fact is, old man, they were drunk. Yes, drunk. And they dropped me out of the car. For I said to them, I says, 'I'm better without you, 'cause you're all drunk, and this is respectable neighborhood.' That's where I says, my friend, and I think you'll agree that it was well spoken on my part." These three last words came with a rush, for he had suddenly released his hold and had swung around alarmingly. "Nay, they won't do, mister," said Mr. Oakroyd, making a grab at him. "You'll never get home at that rate. Now, where is it you live?" "Just round the corner, round the good old Johnny Horner," replied George with enthusiasm. "We're all right. You're a good fella. You been to races this time?" "No, I've not, nor nowhere else either for a long time. Hold up, mister, hold up." But George had swung right over and was now slowly collapsing against the railings. His legs slowly slid over the pavement, but he still kept on talking. "You're a wise man, to stay at home." And he said this several times as his head sank lower and lower. "Nay, brace up. Mr. Oakroyd tried to pull him up, but the man was heavy and a dead weight now. For a moment it looked as if he were going to sleep, and Mr. Oakroyd gave him a series of nudges and shakings, and at last succeeded in arousing him a little. After he had made an effort and Mr. Oakroyd had put out all his strength to assist him, George rose very unsteadily to his feet and staggered 1 or 2 paces forward. "'Ere, what's this?" said Mr. Oakroyd, picking up an unusually bulky pocketbook. "This must be yours," and he handed it over. The other waved it in the air. "My note case. Full to the brim with money. Hundredish of pounds, hundredish. Must have dropped out pocket." Then he came closer and held the pocketbook only about 2 inches from Mr. Oakroyd's nose. I thank you. Knew you were a good fellow, an honest man. Come here," he added, ignoring the fact that it would be impossible for his companion to be any closer than he already was. Indeed, he himself stepped back a pace as he continued, "Come here. You gave me this, I give you something. Yes, I do. Fair's fair. That's George's motto." He fumbled in the pocketbook. "Come here. Hold hand out." Mr. Oakroyd found himself clasping some crisp pieces of paper. They felt like banknotes, and there were 4 of them. He did not stop to examine them, but held them out to the donor, who was busying himself with the pocketbook. "Look here, mister, I can't take these," he said, for his code demanded that he should help a drunken man if he possibly could, and also that he should not take advantage of a man's drunken freaks of generosity. "Worse, eh?" George was still busy fastening his pocketbook and putting it away. "I say, I can't take these," he repeated, almost pushing the notes in the other's face. "What mean can't take 'em? I tell you I give 'em. Little present for the boy." "If I take these," said Mr. Oakroyd earnestly and somewhat unwisely, "you'll be sorry in the morning." This offended George. "What mean sorry in the morning?" he cried aggressively. "Money's mine, isn't it? Do what I like with it, can't I? Can I or can't I? Is it mine or isn't it? Can I or can't I? Answer plain questions." And he brought his face as near as he could. Mr. Oakroyd stepped back and began to feel impatient, but said nothing. Come on. Let's have answer plain questions. Can I or can't I? Have I gore asked you what do with it?" "Oh, don't be such a damn fool, mister," cried Mr. Oakroyd, tired of this daft catechism. "Damn fool, eh? All right. That's finish? Absolutely finish." And he made a sweeping gesture that nearly threw him off his feet. "You go to hell now, anywhere. Finish. No friend of mine." He turned away and staggered forward at a surprising pace. Mr. Oakroyd, stuffing the notes in his pocket, hurried after him. Half a minute, he cried to the swaying figure. The indignant George stopped for a moment to shout, "You go to hell, I don't want you, don't you follow me," and off he went again around the corner into Park Drive. A few yards further on, he stopped again. "Don't you follow me, you're a bad fellow, you are. You leave me alone." But Mr. Oakroyd only increased his pace and was almost up to him when a large figure stepped out of a shadowy gateway and confronted the pair of them. "'Ere, what's all this about?" said the policeman, flashing his lamp on their face. George pulled himself up and saluted. "Good evening, constable." "Just going home. You know me, don't you?" The policeman took another look at him. "Yes, I think I know you, sir. You live down here, don't you?" "Well, sooner you're home, the better, if you ask me. And what's all this noise about? Who's this here?" "That's the point," replied George gravely. "Who is he?" "I don't know who he is. I just told him he's a bad fella, and I don't want him following me. You tell him he's a bad fella." The police flashed his lamp over Mr. Oakroyd again. "Now then, what's the game?" "There's no game," said Mr. Oakroyd rather sulkily. "I found him rolling drunk up the road and gave him a hand, that's all." "Rollin' drunk!" exclaimed George, horror-stricken. "You're a bad fella, and I told you not to keep following me." "You be off," said the policeman to Mr. Oakroyd, "and leave him alone. And you get off home, sir, afore somebody else starts following you. You've not far to go." "Aye, cap'n," said George, and George gave another salute and zigzagged down the road. Mr. Oakroyd moved on after him, but a shout from the policeman behind pulled him up. "Didn't I tell you to be off?" cried the policeman, who had now caught up to him. "Get off and leave him alone afore you get in trouble." "He's not the only chap as is going home," Mr. Oakroyd was indignant. "I've as much a right to walk down the street as he has. I'm going home, too. I'm not going to bother with him. He's daft drunk. Where do you live?" "Ogden Street." "That's a good way from here," said the policeman suspiciously. "Aye, but this is the nearest way to it, and that's all I care about." "Well, walk on the other side, then. I shall stand here and watch you, and don't let me see you round here again tonight." "I don't want to ever set my eyes on thee again, lad," Mr. Oakroyd muttered to himself as he crossed the road. He walked as fast as he could now, and took the first possible turning out of Park Drive. "I wonder who that were," he said to himself. I've seen some silly drunks in my time, but I never saw one sillier." He had to slow down a little because his heart, which had been given a bump or two by that unpleasant talk with the policeman, kept missing a beat and seemed to make him short of breath. Thus it was very late indeed, and when he finally arrived at 51 Ogden Street, and even Leonard was obviously in bed, he found a piece of buttered currant tea cake, took a large and comforting bite out of it, and then smoothed out on the table 4 5-pound notes. 20 pounds. Only twice before had he ever possessed such a sum, and then it had been scraped together, shilling added to shilling, but here was 20 pounds that had fallen to him out of the blue. What should he do with it? He crept upstairs, pondering. I would like to thank you so much for joining me on this stream, reading the first 3 chapters of J.B. Priestley's The Good Companions. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful night, and good reads.